The world believed Princess Diana's fortune would vanish into the royal vault after her death. They were wrong. When executors unsealed her will in 1997, they discovered something the palace never anticipated.
You think you know the story of Princess Diana's death. The grief, the flowers at the palace gates, Elton John at the piano, a nation brought to its knees. But here is what most people have never been told. In the days and weeks that followed the tragedy in Paris, a quiet but explosive battle erupted behind closed doors. One fought not with words or cameras, but with legal documents, court orders, and a handwritten letter that Diana had trusted would be honored. The woman who had spent her life fighting to be heard found her voice suppressed one final time, not by the royal establishment she had escaped, but by the very people she had trusted most. This is the true story of what happened to Princess Diana's estate, who she actually named in her will, who held the real power over her legacy, how that power was used in ways she almost certainly never intended, and why the details of her final wishes were kept secret from the public and even from the families of her closest friends for years after she was gone. When you understand what really happened to her £21 million estate, it changes everything you thought you knew about the woman, her family, and the shadow she still casts over the British royal family today. Diana Frances Spencer was born on July 1, 1961, at Park House on the royal estate in Sandringham, Norfolk, the third daughter of Edward John Spencer, Viscount Althorp, and his wife Frances. From her very first days, she was surrounded by aristocratic tradition, wealth, and particular weight of upper-class English expectation. She grew up in a household that fractured when she was just 6 years old, when her parents' marriage collapsed in a bitter and very public divorce. Her mother, Frances, left for another man and ultimately lost custody of her children in court, a detail that would echo through Diana's life and, as it turned out, through her death. By the time Diana was 20 years old, she was working as a kindergarten teaching assistant in London, living with flatmates in Earl's Court, almost completely ordinary by every outward measure. Then came the engagement to Prince Charles in February 1981, and the world tipped on its axis. The wedding on July 29, 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral was watched by an estimated 750 million people around the globe. Her ivory silk gown with its 25-foot train became one of the most famous dresses in human history. The world had found its fairy tale, but fairy tales have a habit of concealing their costs. Behind the gilded facade of royal life, Diana was deeply isolated. Charles maintained his long connection with Camilla Parker Bowles, and Diana later acknowledged she had known about it almost from the beginning. The pressures of royal life and the breakdown of her marriage contributed to serious struggles with her mental health, including bulimia, which she later discussed publicly with extraordinary courage. The palace preferred silence. Diana chose honesty. In 1992, the separation was formally announced. The same year, recorded phone calls between Charles and Camilla were published in the press, causing global scandal. In November 1995, Diana sat down with journalist Martin Bashir for a panorama interview that shattered every remaining pretense. She spoke of her bulimia, her loneliness, her knowledge of Charles's affair, and her doubts about whether Charles was suited to be king. It remains one of the most watched television interviews in British history. The divorce was finalized in August 1996. Diana lost the title of Her Royal Highness, but she gained something the palace could never reclaim: the genuine love of the public, uncomplicated by protocol or obligation. The years between the separation and her death were marked by a restless, purposeful energy. She threw herself into humanitarian work that was, by any measure, extraordinary. In 1987, at a time when AIDS patients were routinely shunned, she shook hands without gloves with patients at the Middlesex Hospital and sat beside them, spoke to them, treated them as human beings at a moment when most public figures were too frightened to be in the same room. In January 1997, she walked through active minefields in Angola in a visor and body armor, and the images that emerged drove a global campaign that led directly to the Ottawa Treaty, signed later that year, which banned anti-personnel landmines. 164 countries would eventually sign it. She was, by the summer of 1997, 36 years old, newly free, deeply purposeful, and seemingly at the beginning of something rather than the end of it. On August 31, 1997, she died in a car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. The world that had adored her stopped. Princess Diana signed her last will and testament on June 1, 1993, 4 years before her death, and 3 years before her divorce was finalized. At the time, she was still married to Charles, still living within the orbit of a royal family, and already planning for a future that might not include either. The document was drawn up by the firm Mishkin de Rea, one of London's most respected solicitors, and it was both clear and considered in its instructions. The will named 2 executors and trustees: her mother, the Honorable Frances Ruth Shan Kidd, and her private secretary at the time, Commander Patrick Desmond Christian Jeremy Jeffson. These were the 2 people she trusted above all others with the administration of her estate. But in February 1996, everything changed. Patrick Jeffson resigned from his role as Diana's private secretary, suddenly and from the outside, without full explanation. Diana signed a codicil to her will the same month, formally replacing Jeffson as executor with her sister, Lady Elizabeth Sarah Lavinia McCorquodale. The codicil was witnessed by her solicitor and by her butler, Paul Burrell, whose name would soon become synonymous with the controversy surrounding her estate. The main body of the will directed that all of Diana's personal property, her chattels in legal terminology, meaning everything from clothes and jewelry to cars and personal effects, be given to her executors, who were instructed to honor any written notes or memoranda of her wishes regarding their distribution. The bulk of the residual estate was to be held in trust for her sons, Princes William and Harry, who were to receive their inheritance when they turned 25. Diana also named 17 godchildren as beneficiaries and left a personal bequest to her butler, Paul Burrell, in the amount of £50,000. She designated certain intellectual property rights, copyrights, trademarks, and royalties from the authorized commercial use of her name and image for the benefit of a discretionary trust to be used for charitable purposes or for her sons. Alongside the will, Diana wrote a letter of wishes, a separate document signed the day after the will itself, on June 2, 1993. It was not legally binding in the same way as the will, but it expressed her clear intentions with regard to the distribution of her personal property. In it, she asked her executors to divide her jewelry and 3/4 of her chattels between William and Harry, and to distribute the remaining quarter among her 17 godchildren. It was a generous and considered gesture, the kind that reflects a woman who was thinking carefully about the people she loved and what she wanted to leave them. By the time Diana died on August 31, 1997, her gross estate was valued at £21,711,485 by the High Court of Justice in England. After inheritance taxes, a bill of approximately £13.9 million, the net estate available for distribution was around £17 million. This was the sum over which her mother and sister now held extraordinary power. Here is the detail that changes everything, the one that most retellings of Diana's story obscure or omit entirely. Princess Diana did not leave her estate to a single dramatic figure from outside the royal world. She did not bequeath her legacy to a rebel or a confidant operating in secret. She left it, in the most formal, legal, documented sense, to her mother. Frances Ruth Shan Kidd was Diana's primary executor. She was the first name on the will, the person Diana had placed in charge of her estate above all others. In December 1997, just weeks after the funeral, Frances and Lady Sarah McCorquodale went to the High Court and obtained what is known as a variation order, a legal mechanism that permitted them to alter the distribution of Diana's estate in ways that deviated from the written instructions Diana had left behind. The changes were significant. Under the terms Diana had specified, William and Harry were to receive their inheritance at 25. Under the variation order, that age was pushed to 30. Under Diana's letter of wishes, each of her 17 godchildren was to receive a meaningful share, roughly 1/4 of the value of all her personal property, divided between them, with each individual share estimated to be worth around £100,000 at the time. Under the variation order, each godchild instead received a single item, chosen at the executor's discretion, which some of the recipients later described publicly as a tacky memento. The change to the letter of wishes was carried out without informing the parents of the godchildren, most of whom were minors at the time. The families only discovered what had happened years later, through an entirely unrelated court case, the 2002 trial of Paul Burrell, Diana's former butler, who was accused of stealing 310 items from her estate. When the details of the variation order finally came to light, the reaction from the godchildren's families ranged from shock to outrage. Why did Frances and Lady Sarah make these changes? The honest answer is that no one outside their inner circle has ever explained it definitively. Legal commentators have offered several theories. Some suggest the change was made to protect William and Harry from receiving a large sum of money at a vulnerable age. 25, after all, is young for someone still grieving a murdered parent and growing up under the scrutiny of the entire world. Others have pointed to the fact that during the intervening 17 years, 150 items from Diana's personal collection were displayed in a traveling exhibition organized by her brother, Earl Spencer, which raised more than £2 million for charitable purposes. But there is a harder question embedded in all of this. Diana had written a letter of wishes. She had asked her executors to honor it within 2 years of her death. She had used clear, if not legally binding, language about what she wanted. And those wishes were overridden in private, without the knowledge of the people most directly affected, and in a way that was only discovered by accident years later. The question of whether this was what Diana would have wanted, whether the woman who spent the last decade of her life fighting to have her voice heard would have approved of her final written instructions being quietly set aside, is one that no one can now answer. No account of Diana's estate can avoid the figure of Paul Burrell, who served as her personal butler from 1987 until her death in 1997. Burrell occupied a unique and intimate place in Diana's life. He managed her household at Kensington Palace, traveled with her, and by his own account was among her closest confidants in the years after the separation from Charles. His name appears on the codicil to Diana's will as a witness alongside her solicitor when she replaced Patrick Jeffson with Lady Sarah McCorquodale in February 1996. In October 2002, Burrell was charged with the theft of 310 items from Princess Diana's estate. The items ranged from personal letters and private correspondence to clothing and gifts. The trial became one of the most sensational legal proceedings in British tabloid history, a daily feast of royal intrigue and intimate detail. Then, at a dramatic moment in the proceedings, Queen Elizabeth II informed her advisers that she recalled a conversation with Burrell shortly after Diana's death, in which he had told her he was taking certain items for safekeeping. The prosecution collapsed immediately. Burrell was acquitted. The Burrell case had consequences far beyond the acquittal itself. It was during the legal proceedings surrounding the trial that the existence and the details of the variation order and the deviation from Diana's letter of wishes regarding the godchildren first became public. The families of the godchildren, who had never been consulted or informed, learned through newspaper reports connected to the Burrell case what had happened to the inheritance Diana had intended for their children. The revelation landed like a stone in a still pond. Burrell himself, in the years following the trial, became both a chronicler of Diana's life and a controversial figure. One of the most consequential details of the entire Diana estate story is also one of the most technical: the difference between a formal will and a letter of wishes under British law. It is a distinction that cost Diana's godchildren a share of an estate worth roughly £17 million, and it serves as one of the most striking examples in modern legal history of how informal language in estate planning can unravel even the most carefully considered intentions. Under English law, a letter of wishes is a document that can accompany a formal will and is intended to give executors guidance on how to exercise their discretionary powers. But it is precisely that guidance. It is not legally binding in the way that a formally worded clause in a will is binding. When Diana used language like discretion and wishes in her letter of wishes, she was, without realizing it, giving her executors the legal latitude to depart from those wishes if they judged it appropriate to do so. The court that reviewed the variation order in December 1997 ruled that the letter of wishes lacked the specific legal language required to make it enforceable. This meant that Francis Shankidd and Lady Sarah McCorquodale were legally entitled to disregard it, and they did. The godchildren's quarter share was reduced to a single memento each, chosen by the executors, and delivered not until Prince Harry turned 30 in 2014, 17 years after Diana's death. The legal lesson is stark. Diana had a will. She had a letter of wishes. She had clear intentions that she had committed to paper. And yet the people she trusted to carry out those intentions had both the legal power and, for whatever reason, the will to set them aside. The gap between what Diana wanted and what actually happened was not created by the courts, or by the royal family, or by any external force. It was created by the very mechanism she had put in place to protect her legacy, the appointment of executors who had the authority to interpret and ultimately override the spirit of her wishes in favor of their own judgment. Solicitors and estate planning professionals have cited Diana's case for decades as a cautionary illustration of why informal letters must be either incorporated directly into a formal will or replaced by legally binding trust structures. The irony is almost unbearable. The woman who spent her adult life struggling to make her voice heard in a world that consistently tried to silence her ended up, at the very last, writing instructions that the law did not require anyone to follow. Whatever the controversies surrounding its administration, Princess Diana's estate and the charitable trust created in her name went on to fund work that had genuine and measurable impact on the world. The Diana